Hey Joe,
Hey.
what's this all about?
Well, we have a problem, and it's a very big problem. And unfortunately, most people aren't aware of it. It doesn't matter what your personal views are, your politics, your religion, or where you are. And once you see the problem, you can't unsee it. It's like a one-way door. But thankfully, we also have the solution. And it's this solution that I'm so passionate about sharing. And it's what makes me just so optimistic for the future. The challenge I find, though, is how can anybody fully value a solution unless they understand what the problem is? And so I put this presentation together for some friends, and it assumes no knowledge other than just being a human being with some life experience. And they encouraged me then to make this presentation into video so I can share it with everyone. So I hope you enjoy it. Welcome to What's the Problem? So what is the problem? Well, too many, unfortunately. I probably could have written twice as many things down on this slide. I think we all have that sense of unease. We all feel internally that things are not moving in the right direction in our lives, in the world. Like things are becoming harder, not easier. And I think for most of us, we would recognize some elements of these things on the screen as touching our lives directly or indirectly. And what I'm here today to show you is that all these things may seem unconnected, but they're really not. The primary cause of all of these is the quality of our money. Now we're going to do this through a story. So imagine there's this far-off world where you have hundreds of smart people traveling on a ship. And this ship gets wrecked on a deserted island. This deserted island is so far from everywhere else, they're effectively cut off. But the island is resource rich. It has everything they could possibly need to rebuild society. But because these people have come from an advanced civilization, they know exactly where they're ultimately going to get back to. But now they're starting again with nothing. What's also clear is that they need some way of trading with each other once they start to rebuild. So they prioritize deciding on what to use for their new money. And suspend your disbelief slightly further in that they have, despite not having anything, the ability to create whatever monetary system they want with whatever characteristics. So the first question they need to answer is, what makes good money? And there are 7 things. So these guys have the ability to create whatever they want. So instead of just creating good money, they create the perfect money. And the perfect money is scarce, which means it has a fixed supply forever, and is instantly and costlessly verifiable by everybody. So if everybody can check it whenever they want at no cost, then you can verify for yourself that nobody's creating any extra. It needs to be portable, so you can effortlessly move and store it with negligible costs. It needs to be divisible, and the perfect money would be infinitely divisible. It needs to be durable. It can't rot or go off. It can't deteriorate. So the perfect money exists forever. It's fungible, which means every piece is forever the same as every other piece. It needs to be acceptable. So everyone, anywhere, can both send and receive. And the really important one is it needs to be censorship resistant. You hold it yourself. Nobody can take it away from you without your permission, and no one can stop you sending or receiving it. So this is great. They decide on perfect money. But then there's a disagreement. 2 leaders emerge from within the population. The first, Satoshi, he says, well, given these are the characteristics of perfect money, that's going to be true today, true tomorrow, and true forever. So we should lock them in, you should never change. Whereas Fiatello, he says, well, I get that. I get this is the characteristics of perfect money, and I totally agree. But what if there's an emergency? What if we need to change something? What if the people we put in charge of our money feel like it's not working and need to make an adjustment? I think we should have the perfect money, but we should also have a big red button, which allows someone to press it and change any of the characteristics if we need to. Of course, no one ever will, but just in case. This becomes an irreconcilable disagreement. So a fairly drastic solution, but they build a huge wall right down the middle of this island. And on one side, they create the currency called Satoshis, which is perfect money always. And on the other side, are fiatellos, which is perfect money, but with the option to change it. Now this wall is so big, it cuts off the communication and the trade between both sides on the island. So effectively, they're cut off from one another. So to begin with, nobody has anything on either side of the island. So everyone's starting from zero. And initially, people have to be self-sufficient. Each person is fishing for their food, cutting down trees for the wood to make fires, and also for houses, and then they're also building their own shelters. Now, even though they have perfect money, there's very limited trading here because people are working hard just to satisfy their day-to-day needs across all of these goods. But people are different. Some people are better at some things than others. And so people quickly realize that if I spend my time focusing on the things I'm good at, I'm reducing the amount of time I spend on things that I'm poor at, then I can contribute more to society. I can increase the amount of goods I can provide to society in the same amount of time as the average person. So the woodcutter spends all his time now cutting down wood. He stops fishing, he stops building shelters. And because he's spending his time cutting down wood, he increases the quantity of wood available to everyone else versus 3 people spending a third of their time each, because he's good at it. And not only does the increase in the quantity of wood available reduce the price of wood for everybody on the island, the quality is also high. He's better at doing it. He produces a higher quality output. So prices fall and quality increases. And not only that, he's not the only woodcutter. There are multiple woodcutters. So they're all competing to supply wood to everybody else. And they're competing at price and in terms of quality. And now what happens is, because the woodcutter needs other goods to survive, he has to sell the wood to buy fish, he has to sell the wood to pay for the services of the home builder. So now everybody is actively trading in this perfect money. Now, because processes continue to improve, the woodcutter can now satisfy the needs of the rest of the population for wood in a smaller amount of time. He can then take that time and think about his own processes, his own innovations. Maybe he can make cutting down wood even more efficient. And if he does that, it drives prices lower. It drives quality higher. Maybe he reaches the end of his innovation within his woodcutting and then uses the excess money and excess capital he has to invest in other people. Maybe he lends it to the fisherman, who then builds a boat to increase the amount of fish the fisherman can catch for everybody. So what happens over time in a free market with perfect money, prices go down forever and quality goes up forever. So what people see on both sides of the island is that the purchasing power of their money starts to increase. Goods cost less tomorrow than they do today, so the price of tomorrow is lower. The purchasing power of both currencies is increasing at about 3% a year. And this lifts the quality of life. Life becomes cheaper and cheaper over time for everybody, not just those people who are most productive in society. But the key thing is the money itself is becoming more valuable over time. That is, until these guys come along. So now, because the society is growing and the population is growing, both sides of the island elect a government. Now, it doesn't matter if the government is left or right, big, small, up, down, doesn't matter. They are all the same when it comes to this. Now, however well run the government is, inevitably it will hit a deficit at some point. And that means it's spending more than it's receiving. And that could be through mismanagement, but it could just be through external circumstance, like a natural disaster or something like this. The causes are not important, but it will happen over the course of time, inevitably. But now we see a divergence across both sides of the island. Satoshi, he only has 2 choices here. To balance the budget, he needs to either raise taxes or cut spending, or maybe a combination of the two. Whereas Fiatello, he has exactly the same choices, but he also has a big red button. And the important thing here is they're both up for re-election. And Fiatello knows that if he raises taxes or he cuts spending, it's going to cost him votes. So just this time, he decides to press the big red button and print a little bit of extra money for the government. Okay, so what are the consequences? Well, for Satoshi, not great. He cannot hide those changes from the population because they're paying more in taxes or they're getting less back from the government from its spending. So he loses the election, but government reduces in size naturally. So now overall, the efficiency in the economy is increased, but not only this, the social balance is improved within the economy because people now realize there is no free money. Taxes need to balance spending. But the important thing is prices continue to fall and quality continues to increase. Now for Fiatello, great news, he gets re-elected. And to start with, it's consequence free. Like he thinks this is the greatest thing ever. I get re-elected and there's no downside. But something's changed. So what's happened? Fiatello's pressed the big red button, which has printed some money for the government, which has debased the currency. So what does that mean? He's increased the amount of money in the economy overnight. But he hasn't increased the amount of goods and services available in the economy overnight. So now there's more Fiatellos washing around compared to yesterday for each piece of the goods and the services. And this has three major impacts. The first is a distortion of price signals. The second is that it increases input costs for businesses. And the third, it leads to asset inflation. And that first one, distorting price signals, well, prior to Fiatello pressing the big red button here, all price changes in the economy were purely a function of demand and supply because this was a free market with perfect money. But what's happened now is that money has entered the economy not to everybody equally or even in proportion to the amount of money everybody holds. The money has entered the economy via the government, and it enters via the government into the accounts of companies and people connected directly or indirectly to the government. So what Fiatello starts to see is price increases in certain parts of the economy. So the signal to everybody else in the economy is that there's an imbalance of supply and demand just in these sectors. So you see a misallocation of capital by the entrepreneurs in the market caused by the money printer. But not only that, it's human capital. It's smart people, it's active people who are trying to be productive, get sucked in closer to the government and not servicing the rest of the economy. The second is that business input costs increase. Now, every single business in Fiatello's country has at least a human being and some raw material inputs like energy or even some harder raw materials. Now, because the costs of these things have gone up, these businesses now need to try and change something about their product to maintain the small profit margins that ensure that they can continue in business. Now, the first and most obvious one is just to pass on the price increase to the customer. The second is to keep the price the same and the quality the same, but just shrink the product. So instead of having 100 grams, it's now 90 grams, but for the same price. Or the third one is to reduce the input costs. Now, this is where consumer inflation comes from. This is the only source of consumer inflation, is the money printer, causing businesses to make these changes. But if a business passes on the price increase outright, or it shrinks the product and the customer now just needs to buy more of it to satisfy the fact that they needed 100 grams, not 90 grams, both of those things reduce affordability. So the population is becoming poorer. They're going to have less disposable income, despite buying the same as what they bought yesterday. If instead the business chooses to keep the price the same, the size the same, but just reduce the cost, the most obvious thing to do is just to fire people, which leads to unemployment. And now there are fewer people with jobs, which reduces the overall affordability for the population in Fiatello's world. But not only that, now the government's got a second issue it needs to solve. How does it help support all these people who are recently unemployed? But the most insidious way is for companies to reduce their input quality. And so what Fiatello starts to see is there's a rise in obesity across the population because the food that was previously fresh and had high quality ingredients is replaced with ever lower quality ingredients and more industrialized sludge. So this leads to obesity. It also leads to a myriad of secondary health issues, which causes a health crisis. And now the government has to step in and figure out how it needs to support all these people who are now unhealthy. The third is asset inflation. Since Fiatello pressed the big red button, asset prices have been going up. The stock market goes higher and higher and higher. House prices go higher and higher and higher. He thinks I'm some sort of economic genius. But they're going up in price because he's just created more Fiatellos. So anybody who knows that there are more Fiatellos in the system, of course, wouldn't sell their asset for the same as they did yesterday. They would take into account the fact that there are just more Fiatellos in the system. So this is what is driving these prices up. But this asset increase is good for the people who own the assets, but not for the people who don't. So he has a wealth inequality begin to emerge across the economy. And not just that, because house prices are now more expensive, the rent is more expensive. So he sees increased levels of homelessness. And this increased levels of homelessness, guess what, require more government intervention to try and deal with. And now asset prices are flying, the stock market's on fire. The prevailing perception across the population is, why would I not invest? Why would I just keep the money? I should be buying the stock market, I should be investing, I should be buying a second home to rent out, I should be buying speculative assets because they never go down, they just go up. If I don't invest, I'm a fool. And because the assets are going up, the banks are pushing ever more leverage for people, pushing bigger and bigger mortgages to individuals, to loans to companies. But now that house prices have gone up, and now that everyone has more debt, at the same time as families are struggling with affordability of day-to-day life, it's now much harder to buy a house. So families where previously they could have one main earner and afford to buy a house with a mortgage can't anymore. You now need both parents working. Both parents working to afford the mortgage and afford to live. And when that happens, people spend less time together and you start to see the breakdown of the nuclear family. They spend less time with their children. They can afford to have fewer children. Now, because you have decline in birth rates, Fiatello starts to see a change in his demographics across the population. Fewer children are being born, whereas the older generations are living longer. And he now starts to realize that the promises he made to these older generations about being able to retire at a certain age or having a good quality of life or defined income in their retirement can't be delivered upon. For those not lucky enough to be able to buy a house, who are maybe stuck renting. Whereas before, they could think about renting the same place for 3 years or 5 years because the rent goes up too much every year. So now they're thinking about 1 year, maybe 2 years. You're planning less for the future. Maybe you're putting off getting married, putting off having children. You start to prioritize today at the expense of tomorrow. People see that they're saving their Fiatellos never gets them anywhere because the asset prices are going up too quickly. They'll never be able to buy a house. So if you never be able to buy a house, then prioritize living your best life and going on a holiday and spending more, enjoying yourself. But for those not fortunate to be in this position, for those that every day is a struggle feeding themselves and their families, housing themselves and their families, they're stuck on a treadmill of decline. Now, every day is harder, which leads to a growth in addiction, various forms of addiction, including opioids across Fiatello's island, which leads to yet more of a health crisis and yet more intervention from the government. And all of this leads to a mental health crisis across the population. And now the government finds itself in a position where, because it's pressed the big red button, it's created a whole range of secondary issues that now it needs to step in and try and solve. And because it has to step in and try and solve these things, it means the government needs to divert more capital to these areas of the economy, which again is a greater misallocation of capital, which pulls more entrepreneurs into the wrong parts of the economy through the distortion of the price signals. And between the increased leverage in the economy driven by the banks and the misallocation of capital, it sows the seeds of the next emergency. And Fiatello has only one choice, and that's to press the big red button again. And now he's starting to realize that actually this wasn't consequence-free. But now he's lurching from crisis to ever bigger crisis. He presses the big red button, which debases the currency, which leads to bigger government and more involvement in everything. And now not only is the government bigger, but the government has spawned a series of parasitic industries attached to it. Big Pharma, who are increasingly involved with the government to try to deal with the symptoms, but not the causes of the various health crises. Never incentivized to actually cure a patient, just to treat them long term, because a healthy customer is a lost customer. Big Food pushes for ever lower food standards across the economy. The military-industrial complex pushes for ever greater spending on defence, both at home and on foreign shores. Wall Street are up to their eyeballs in debt and now so leveraged that the government wants to protect them. They can't be allowed to fail, because if the banks fail, the population loses their money, the government falls. The government also continues to make unproductive investments. Investments trying to deal with the secondary issues it's created, but also investments driven from whatever political ideology the government has. And all of these things are effectively now crony corporatism. It's very hard to see where the government ends and these industries begin. The success of the government is deeply intertwined with the success of the industries. These industries start to ask the government to become regulators. You need to regulate us to protect the public. But this regulation, all it does is make competition harder. The 1, 2, 3 companies in each of these areas are now very, very close to the government. They supply the people for the regulator. When the regulators end their tenure, they go back and work for these companies. It stops smaller companies coming in and competing with them to then supply the government on better terms or with higher quality product. So quality starts to decline and prices start to rise, which of course is great news for these companies because profit margins go up. What happens then is the media gets captured. The government is teetering to maintain social stability. It's now protecting these industries at the expense of the population rather than the other way around. And because of this social balance that it needs to maintain, it can't allow free speech, dissent, alternative opinions, or questioning of anything that undermines the legitimacy of the government in any way. Not only that, the biggest advertisers for the media companies are the companies connected to the government. So the media companies increasingly don't want to upset their advertisers. And when you have a captured media and a military-industrial complex fomenting strife on foreign shores, you get the creation of the forever wars. And the wars themselves are actively supported by the Fiatello population because all they see in their media is that we have to do this because it's the right thing to do. And between the forever wars and the banking system bailouts and the excessive debt, it leads to the next emergency, but this time it's just so much bigger. And the only choice he has is to press the big red button again. But this time it's different. It's a massive erosion of trust. Every time he presses the button, more and more people become aware of what is happening. And this goes round and round and round until something breaks. And now Fiatello's starting to get quite worried. So what's happening to the money? Well, instead of increasing 3% a year in purchasing power, he's now losing 7% a year because he's printing 10% a year of extra money. And not only that, he's undermining the productivity in the economy by distorting all the price signals. So what happens to the Fiatello Island population? Well, the poor, who are on fixed wages, have very low income security and no assets. They can't win. They just get poorer every single year. For the middle earners, who have fixed salaries and mixed income security, they're not the first to be fired. They often have a home. They can never sell the home and realize any gain because you've got to live somewhere. If you sell one home, you've got to buy another home. You might have some investments, but they are becoming the new poor. Well, surely the wealthy are doing well. Their income is largely from asset yields, from operating businesses or investing. Their income security is high because they can't get fired. But for them, it's death by 1,000 cuts. They see their wealth as a number continue to increase. But they feel like they're getting poorer. Life continues to get harder. And that's because the rate at which they're earning money, their yield on their assets, is below the rate at which Fiatello is printing money. So they're slowly having their wealth siphoned away by the politically connected. Those that are government funded and have fully insulated income security. And perversely, their income goes up and becomes even more valuable as society continues to decline because the government needs more and more intervention. And it's really just industrialized theft at this point from everyone else in society. But now so much time has passed that the wall down the middle of the island starts to crack. And it starts to crack in such a way that both people and money can start to flow from one side to the other. So on the one side, you've got the Satoshis increasing their purchasing power at 3% a year. On the other side, you've got the Fiatellos that are losing 7% purchasing power every year. So what happens? Why? What Fiatello starts to see is that money and people start to leave because they don't trust their ability to save using Fiatellos. They want Satoshis. Okay, so this sums it up. On a Fiatello standard, your money is stealing from you. Whereas on a Satoshi standard, the whole world is working 24/7 to increase your purchasing power. But now the escape valve is open. People realize they can't save in Fiatellos, so they start selling Fiatellos to buy Satoshis. So the Fiatellos decline further in value, triggering yet more budgetary and currency crises for Fiatello to deal with. And the only choice is to press the big red button again. But this time, printing money is not enough because value is leaking out of Fiatello's side of the island. He needs to change another characteristic of perfect money, which is to remove the censorship-resistant nature of it. So the Fiatello population used to be able to hold the money themselves. Now Fiatello says, no longer allowed to hold it yourselves, you have to put it in the banks. The banks are going to hold everybody's money. The population now feel that they are guilty until proven innocent for making any transaction. The banks will check every transaction to protect you. Which means when people are trying to buy certain things, including Satoshis, the banks now say no. It's because of this, it's because of that, it's because of the other. He restricts the flow of capital out of Fiatello's side of the island. He may even just create explicit capital controls. You're now no longer allowed to buy Satoshis at all. But people always find a way, and more people are waking up to what's happening, and the cycle continues. But the important thing is the wealth and the people flee to the uncorrupted money. And now Fiatello is beginning to really panic. So where does it end for Fiatello? Well, if he's lucky, with sustained inflation, allowing the government to inflate away its debts and slowly siphon away the wealth of the public. This may even border on hyperinflation. I say lucky because it's very hard to do that and maintain social cohesion, and something is likely to go wrong. It will definitely be asset seizures. Now that all the money is held in the banks, one day Fiatello will decree that we're all in it together, and the banks will hand over a proportion of that capital to the government. Just like in Cyprus in 2013, if you held over 100,000 euros in the bank overnight, 45% of that went to the government. The public was effectively bailed in to bail out the banks and the government from their own mismanagement. It also happened in the US in 1933. They made gold holdings for the individual illegal. And this lasted for almost 40 years. If you held more than $100 of gold and you were caught, $10,000 fine or 10 years in prison. And this is when $10,000 was a huge amount of money. Fiatello sees a rise in political extremism on both ends of the spectrum. The government never explains to the population where these problems are coming from. They don't tell them it's because of the money printing via the big red button. They control the media. The government is protective of itself. They don't tell the population the truth. They don't help the population join the dots. They don't explain the link from the big red button to the issues. They blame it on the greedy businessmen, or the billionaires, or that foreign dictator, or this or that. And then what happens is people ask for more help and more support from the government to deal with all of these issues, until the only solution is the government's involved in everything. So at every step of this journey, the solution to all the problems has always been more government involvement. And so the people see these problems and vote for more government involvement to solve them. Or something worse. But in all scenarios, people want to hold Satoshis and not fiatellos. So if we go back to that list of 7 characteristics of perfect money, Fiatello only changed 2 of them. The other 5 are still exactly the same. And look where he ended up. Now, the reveal. And some of you may be slightly ahead of me here. The US dollar is just a terrible version of the fiatello. So the US dollar is corrupted on the same 2 key issues that the fiatellos were, but on the other 5 it's materially worse as well. In terms of portability, it's easy to carry, easy to pay, but it's not great for merchants. You pay instantly, but the merchant doesn't get the money for multiple days, and that's if there was no fraud or chargebacks. It's divisible, but only to a point, and removes the ability to do microtransactions, which will unlock potentially completely different economic models. It's durable in digital form, but we have cash component, and that cash component is constantly undermined. The notes are reprinted in terms of design every 15 or 20 years, so there's no ability for an individual to save outside the banking system. If you put notes under your bed or under the floorboards and leave them 25 years, they're worthless. Those types of notes have gone out of circulation. So you need to take the notes every 15 or 20 years to the bank, hand them in, and get new notes. They re-centralize everything periodically out of choice. They're fungible, which means every dollar is the same as every other dollar until it's not. Some countries around the world have already introduced what are known as CBDCs, which are central bank digital currency. But effectively, it's programmable money. A specific dollar may have an expiration date. You need to spend it before this period of time elapses, or else it disappears. Or a dollar may have only specific use cases. You must spend this dollar on X or Y, or you must not spend this dollar on A, B, C. The dollar is very acceptable around the world, but you can't pay for it everywhere. And typically, most national currencies are only acceptable in their own country. And the US has a major fiatello problem. This is the budget for 2024, the budget, not the actuals, which of course were worse. But deficit of almost 2 trillion on a spend of just over 6 trillion. That's a loss in 1 year. Now, to put that in context, they'd have double the amount of individual income taxes for everybody in the US just to balance that. And on the cost side, they can make some improvements, but there are some key things there you just cannot remove, like the debt interest. And the consequences, well, this is a chart of the amount of money in the system in dollars and the amount of debt issued by the US government over time. Now, I've labeled 1971 on here because that's when the US came unilaterally off the gold standard. Prior to 1971, you could give your dollars back and receive gold in return. Nixon took the US off the gold standard and every currency in the world followed. And since then, it's allowed the US to print unlimited amounts of money to satisfy its own needs. And the red chart on the left-hand axis shows that amount of money is now 22 trillion. And on the right-hand side, you've got the US government debt, which even a month later, this chart is now out of date. It's now 36 trillion. And this doesn't include the unfunded liabilities, the amount of money the US government has committed to pay at some point in the future through Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. But it hasn't had to write the check yet. Now, depending on how you calculate that, it's between 50 and 200 trillion on top of 36 trillion of debt. The only way to solve that is more money printing. So the money printer is systematically destroying the purchasing power of the dollar. Now, you may think I have something against the dollar. I absolutely don't. The dollar is the best that we have. I would love to be able to use the dollar, as would the vast majority of people around the world. But unfortunately, most people just aren't as lucky. This is the performance of all the other currencies versus the dollar over the last 10 years. Some have near enough disappeared completely, and some absolutely have. They've ceased to exist. The people who saved their economic energy in those currencies have seen them vanish. The unfortunate reality here, as the wonderful Lynn Alden repeatedly says, is nothing stops this train There is no way out for governments. The only solution is to keep pressing the big red button. And so the conclusion is a quote from Hayek, who was an economist of the Austrian school, is that the history of government management of money has, except for a few short happy periods, been one of incessant fraud and deception. And he said this in 1988. Now, that would all be pretty depressing if there wasn't a solution. But thankfully, there is. The only solution here is the separation of money and state. The government cannot be allowed access to a big red button. And Hayek again, and this time the quote's from 1984. I don't believe we shall ever have good money again until we take it out of the hands of government. We can't take it violently out of their hands. All we can do is, by some sly, roundabout way, introduce something they just can't stop. Brilliant quote. So I hope now, with these links between the big red button and the money printer and all of these issues that we see in our lives today, that it's now much clearer that if we can fix the money, we'll fix the world. And the good news here, and this is the best news, is that Satoshis are real. And even Fiatello is now a convert. The solution is Bitcoin. One Bitcoin is 100 million Satoshis, in the same way that $1 is 100 cents. Now, you may feel you know about Bitcoin already because of something you've been told by friends or you read in the media. I would encourage you to start again. When we derive our information from media or people who have derived their information from the media, and that media is connected to the people who own and benefit from the money printer, it tends not to be necessarily the most accurate information. So don't trust, verify. Come to satsversusfiat.com. We've set up a website which helps people get up and running. If you're just getting started, maybe even never heard of Bitcoin before, come, sign up, and we'll send you some information so you can learn about it for yourself and make your own decisions about Bitcoin. If you're further along and maybe even call yourself a Bitcoiner already, then amazing. This is not a commercial enterprise for me. This is a charitable one. And so any support from within the Bitcoin community or further afield, I would love to receive. If people want to give this talk themselves to their friends or just share it more broadly, or even volunteer to give a presentation as part of our group, then just get in touch. And the third one is inviting us to speak. We want as many people as possible to see this presentation because the information contained within it about what the problem is so important. So we'd love to speak. If you have us at schools, universities, industry conferences, events, or even at workplaces if people are interested to learn more. So please just get in touch. Here's the QR code which will take you directly to the website. Alternatively, if you are on X and want to come and say hi and join the conversation with us, then please do. Firstly, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Please share this with anyone you care about. And if there's one thing that you take away from this, is I hope you will remember that if we fix the money, we'll fix the world. Thank you.